Okay, just to let you know, we're about to go live in 10 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, we're now live.
So just while people are coming in, we're going to start in just a couple of minutes, just letting the stragglers arrive. I can see there's just a few more people coming in, and so we'll start in just a moment. Well, hello and welcome. My name is Martin Thomas. I teach in the School of History at the Australian National University, or ANU as we call it. The university stands on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. So let's open by acknowledging their ancient and continuing presence in the Canberra region and pay respect to the elders past and emerging. Supported by the Australian Studies Institute at ANU, I'm presently based at King's College London, where I'm co-director of the Menzies Australia Institute. We're part of the School of Global Affairs at King's, which makes today's webinar especially appropriate. Ceremonial Lives of the Nation examines rituals and traditions of the Australian state, with their inevitable borrowings and adaptations from Imperial Britain. Our speakers will be looking at Australia's ceremonial lives, but like so much good research at the moment, the outlook is inevitably transnational. The Menzies Institute in London is especially pleased to be working with the ANU in Canberra for this event, which has prompted interest from around the world. We've had a huge number of registrations, so greetings wherever you are. We hope you enjoy the show. 3 scholars, all from the ANU, are presenting their research today. Now, they all have big CVs, too big to recount here, so I'll introduce them only briefly. Heather Roberts, speaking first, is looking at the rituals around the swearing in of judges. Heather is Associate Professor in the ANU College of Law. Then we have Karen Fox, Research Fellow and Research Editor in the National Centre of Biography within the School of History at ANU. She'll be talking about the Australian Honours System. Our third speaker is Anne McDuff, who'll be looking at citizenship ceremonies. She's a senior lecturer also in the ANU College of Law. Now, the arithmetically minded will notice that that makes 1 historian and 2 legal eagles. So, to temper the mighty force of the law, we've invited Frank Bongiorno, Head of History at ANU, To give a very unjudicial summing up and analysis, thank you to Frank and all the speakers. After Frank Bongiorno, it will be time for questions. A restriction of this type of webinar is that we have to take questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. You can type them at any time during the webinar. Remember to say whether your question is intended for a particular speaker or for the whole panel. And please tell us your name and where you're from. We can't guarantee we'll get through all the questions, but we'll do our best. Great to have you here at Ceremonial Lives. Leading off is Heather Roberts. Over to Canberra.
Well, thank you, Martin, for that introduction. On behalf of all of the panelists, may I also acknowledge the traditional and continuing custodians of the land on which we're gathered, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was never ceded. The central theme of today's event is to explore the way ceremony shapes and defines concepts of the nation and national identity. Specifically, three forms of ceremony that share public celebratory elements in which each induct an individual into a new community or status. The community of judges or honours recipients or Australian citizens. Karen, Anne and I, each in different ways, consider how these ceremonies frame understandings of who and what is valued in the Australian community, changing concepts of diversity and inclusion, and the importance of these ideas, and the ways in which ceremonial encounters reinscribe what it means to be Australian. My research project explores how judicial swearing-in ceremonies, which are held when a new judge is welcomed by the legal community to take their seat on the bench, reinscribe the values of the legal profession and illuminate its vision of its role in Australian society. And by virtue of the uniformity in format across Australian state and territory courts over time, I'm particularly interested in how these values and vision may change. Today, though, I want to take you to one element of that picture through extracts from two ceremonies held in the last 15 years, and to excavate what can be learnt about more recent narratives of nationhood, indigeneity, and belonging in judicial swearing-in ceremonies. In foregrounding these recent extracts, it's not my claim that they are somehow representative of the geographic or historical sweep of what I call court ceremonial archives. Indeed, the reverse. They're atypical by virtue of the very fact that the word Aboriginal appears in the text. For decades, the terms Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous were absent from the transcripts of judicial swearing-in ceremonies. As a consequence, the dominant theme until recently in the ceremonial archive is one of silence by the speakers who represented the legal elite on these occasions, the judges, the attorneys general, the presidents of the Law Society and bar associations. First Nations peoples were simply not relevant in the stories these speakers told of the legal profession, the judiciary, and the history of law in Australia. For my first extract, we'll travel to Western Australia in 2006 and the swearing in of a new Chief Justice. The ceremonies for chiefs are always met with greater grandeur than other judges. For as heads of jurisdiction, these individuals are recognised as having the authority to speak on behalf of the institution on matters of policy, as well as acting as official spokesperson when a response is needed to criticism from governments or interest groups outside the court. As such, the new chief's speech tends to provide a detailed vision statement for the court and the judicial process. In 2006, in Western Australia, Chief Justice Martin spoke as follows. There's a great deal happening in this brief extract. Here, Chief Justice Martin recognises the disproportionate impact of incarceration on Indigenous Australians, and particularly the impact of their removal from country. Indeed, that the Chief Justice acknowledges the importance of country to Indigenous peoples is itself novel in this extract. And further, the Chief Justice here is recognising how a facially neutral system operates in historical and cultural context, and that the legal community needs to be cognizant of these lived realities of Indigenous Australians. The discourse underpinning these remarks is significant. In the rare ceremony that referenced Aboriginal Australians last century, the speakers tended to project a deficit narrative. For example, there were occasional references to the challenges Indigenous Australians had experienced in navigating our complex legal system and the problem that Indigenous populations posed to the community and justice system. These narratives carried the implication not only of an us and them dichotomy, read white and Indigenous peoples, but also that disadvantage and criminality was seen as a function of Aboriginality. Chief Justice Martin does not portray the Indigenous community in this way, but rather recognises the importance of partnership, of listening and learning from the Indigenous community. Indigenous peoples are situated by him as authoritative, as knowers, with wisdom and strength to which he and others need to listen. Were this all the Chief said in his speech, it would stand in stark contrast to the stock narratives which populate the ceremonial archive for over a century. But he does not stop there. He also said this: remember that this passage is not an extract from an after-dinner speech or a presentation at an academic conference, or indeed a webinar. These reflections were intended to be and have become statements by the court incorporated within its archives. Here then, the Chief Justice's speech is a rare illustration of a judge utilising in ceremony the language of genocide to characterise the violence affected by governments in Australia against Indigenous peoples. Note too the significant historical context of this ceremony. In 2006, this was 2 years prior to the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generation. These years after the Bringing Them Home report, and particularly after Mabo and Wick, the land rights decisions, had seen an increased critique of Australia's past as racist and violent. This in turn prompted a conservative reaction through the pejorative metaphor of black armband and its approach to history, and commentaries that recognition of Indigenous land rights posed an existential threat to the socio-economic fabric and future of the Australian nation and concepts of national identity. It was in this context that the Chief Justice made his speech. Chief Justice Martin challenged this conservative narrative. He recognised the role that the legal system played and continues to play in the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples. It confirms his vision that the errors of the past must be addressed frankly and earnestly if justice is to be achieved in the community. But it also confirms that openness is not enough. Action must be taken in partnership together. I want to acknowledge that I'm not claiming to speak for or interpret this speech as an Indigenous Australian. I read this speech from the perspective of a scholar of the ceremonial archives. And so it's in that context that I don't want to be taken here as suggesting this speech represents a golden standard of how Indigenous Australians can be recognised or recorded in court ceremony. But this speech does now stand on the archive as a marker of a moment in time, challenging the stock stories told in courts about Indigenous peoples. It ensures that the trauma suffered by Indigenous peoples cannot be forgotten. It's a narrative that challenges and confronts the assembled audiences in the telling of history and in the boldness of the language used. And it was a narrative designed to do just that. For the second extract, we're going to jump ahead to 2018 and the voice of Barry Mcguire, an elder and traditional owner of the Whadjuk and Nunja communities, on whose traditional lands the Supreme Court of Western Australia is situated. This is how the transcript of that ceremony, which was held to welcome Chief Justice Quinlan, records the opening of Barry Mcguire's remarks. And I want to foreground a number of things in this passage with you. This is an illustration of a more modern practice in swearing-in ceremonies, and indeed many court ceremonies, the joining of First Nations and colonial rituals within the one ceremony. As Mcguire explains, the welcome to country has been practiced by his peoples for thousands of years. Its presence at the outset of the traditional court ritual reinforces that the Indigenous peoples, their culture and law preceded the imposition of British legal traditions that have been inherited by the Western Australian Supreme Court. And here too, Mcguire reinforces that sovereignty was never ceded by the First Nations peoples. Theirs was the prior history, culture and claim. And as such, Mcguire explains, the opening of the ceremony in this traditional legal space with a welcome to country represented an important step in Western Australia in the relationship between First Nations peoples as nations and the legal community. Only through that recognition, Mcguire states, can the next era of history and a new and better pathway to tomorrow begin. The transcript then says this. Through this form of transcription, an essential part of Indigenous culture is extracted from the historical archive. Through the bracketed text, we are seeing a perpetuation of the silencing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, reinforcing the continued power of the English language as the language of the colonising elite. It's not clear to me why Mcguire's words had to be recorded in this fashion. On the one hand, it is the tradition in transcripts to transcribe only the English words that are spoken. And of course, this is a matter of resource allocation as much as anything else. But on the other hand, the Western Australian Supreme Court recognised that this was no ordinary court proceeding, signalled in part by the fact that Mcguire had been invited to perform the welcome to country. As a consequence, we're left with this jarring written text in an archive that 12 years earlier had recognised the fact of governmental genocide, of the attempted eradication of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their language and culture from the Australian continent. So what then can we conclude from these two extracts? On these occasions, members of the community are presenting stories that are coming to terms with histories that are uncomfortable and challenging. Against the background of decades of absence and silence, we now have in judicial swearing-in ceremonies a retelling of narratives of sovereignty, recognition, and nationhood. As Chief Justice Martin also recognised, clearly too, there remains much work to be done. And this is no more tellingly reinforced by the fact that in the courts that I study, the state and territory Supreme Courts in Australia, I cannot take you to an extract of a speech of a judge who self-identified as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And this too is a reminder that what happens in court and in court ceremonies is influenced by and responsive to broader levels of power and how they're exercised to amplify some voices and sideline and marginalise others. As Karen and Anne will discuss, ceremony plays an important role in how those actors outside courts reinforce the values and vision they wish to project about the Australian nation. And I'm delighted now to hand over to Dr. Karen Fox to take us to the theme of ceremony and honours.
Thank you very much, Heather. My opening slide shows one of the functions that Queen Elizabeth II undertook around the empire during her first tour as the reigning monarch in 1954. From Jamaica to Bermuda, Tonga to Fiji, and New Zealand to Australia, she conferred honours, often the Royal Victorian Order, an order of knighthood in her own personal gift, and conducted investitures of awards that would otherwise have been given to recipients by the relevant governors or governors-general. Ceremony, ritual, and symbolism have been key elements of the British honours system and its descendants across the former British Empire. Over their long history, honours have changed in both substance and style. Adaptations, or lack of adaptation, to ceremonial elements of the system can be revealing of wider issues. At the same time, elements of older ceremonial practices have continued in both Britain and Australia, and a sense of tradition, often expressed through ritual and symbolism, form part of the weight and significance of awards. Although Australia has long since replaced the British honours system with its own national awards, Australia's British heritage remains evident in the forms and traditions of its honours system. This paper explores the place of ceremony in the history of honours in Australia and reflects on how this history and these ceremonies express the Australian nation. But first, a little history. Australia's honours system draws many of its traditions and forms from the British honours system. Until 1975, Australians were recognised exclusively through that British system. Central to the British system of honours are the Orders of Chivalry, the Orders of the Garter, the Bath, St Michael and St George, the British Empire, and so on, as well as the Honour of Knight Bachelor, which is a standalone title. The imperial honours system changed and expanded during the 19th century, as shown in this not comprehensive slide. By World War I, it was recognised that honours were largely given for public service, generously defined, and no longer solely to the aristocracy. A crucial development for the history of honours in Australia was the creation of the Order of the British Empire in 1917. It was a significantly larger order than any that had come before, for its purpose was to provide a way of recognising the many people who'd been mobilised for war, particularly in non-combatant work. After the war, it was maintained as an honour for peacetime, and for many decades was the most commonly used order in Australia. So World War I brought about a significant shift in the honours system, vastly broadening its reach across British, and by extension Australian, society. The creation of the Order of the British Empire is also significant as it began to bring women fully into the honours system for the first time. Australia's main honour today, the Order of Australia, was created in 1975 to be a uniquely Australian honour. Its sovereign is the Queen, and its parallels with the British Orders of Chivalry are obvious, in the multi-class structure, for instance, and the names of the various classes. It also has significant parallels to the Order of Canada, to which Labor Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was drawn when setting out to create a system of Australian honours. The Order of Australia was initially created without the titles of Knight and Dame, as was considered befitting for a nation that cherished the ideal of egalitarianism. But these titles were added the very next year, after the Liberal Malcolm Fraser took office as Prime Minister. Abolished in 1986 under Bob Hawke's Labor government, those titles made a brief reappearance in 2014 and 2015 under Liberal Prime Minister Tony Abbott, until his successor, fellow Liberal Malcolm Turnbull, abolished them once more. This history shapes the forms that ritual and ceremony take in the Australian honours system today. The public ceremony associated with the honours system, which I'll be discussing, is the investiture. As Tobias Harper has put it in his recent history of British honours, this aspect of the experience of being granted an honour was both the climax and the most important part for most recipients. In Britain since 1948, anyone appointed to any grade of the Order of the British Empire was entitled to have their award bestowed at a royal investiture, where either the monarch or another royal would confer it on them, and this provided one of the few opportunities for ordinary people to get the chance to meet and speak with their sovereign. For those who were receiving an award at the rank of knighthood, the ritual of conferring the accolade was a central part of the investiture ceremony. This ritual, which involves the monarch or the prince or governor general delegated by her, touching the shoulders of the recipient with the flat side of a sword, has been a key act in the conferral of knighthood since the Middle Ages. After this act takes place, the new knight receives his insignia. And here I want to mention briefly one aspect of the history of honours that touches on the question of diversity and ceremony, which is one of the themes of this panel discussion. As I indicated earlier, prior to the creation of the Order of the British Empire, women were largely excluded from honours. As the Order of the British Empire was being designed, there was some debate about what title should be given to women appointed to its upper two grades, which confer knighthood on men. The choice fell on Dame, but as the Order's historian Peter Galloway has pointed out, this title is not the equivalent of knighthood. While it is frequently assumed that the title Dame means a female knighthood, Galloway tells us that it's not so. Women cannot become a knight of the realm, and the title Dame is merely a way of giving a title to a woman when she is admitted to the class of an order which would confer knighthood and the title of Sir on a man. So women being created Dame did not, and so far as I know still do not, receive the accolade. In Australia, investitures under the modern Order of Australia system are conducted by the Governor-General, state governors and the Administrator of the Northern Territory, as well as in some cases by Australian ambassadors or high commissioners overseas. There are usually 2 ceremonies per year, in April or May, and September or October, and they're generally held at Government House in Canberra and in each state and territory capital. On the Governor-General's website, these events are described as celebrations of the outstanding Australians recognised through the honours and awards system. Recipients are allowed to invite a limited number of guests, but the ceremonies are also recorded and streamed so that they can be shared with a wider audience. In this modern era, these recordings are available on the Governor-General's website and YouTube, and the processes are similar in the state and territory events. To give you a brief description of what happens, I'll take the federal example, conducted by the Governor-General, and I'm describing in particular the September 2019 ceremony. After an introduction and welcome, the guests stand while the Governor-General and his wife enter, and the first verse of the national anthem is sung. The Governor-General, in this case David Hurley, then spoke briefly, emphasising the specialness of the day and acknowledging the pomp and ceremony involved, as he said was appropriate to such a special occasion. But he also reassured the audience that in an Australian government house, they could relax, smile and breathe. I was struck by these comments, which seemed to me to express a particular idea of Australia. This is a formal event, it's steeped in tradition and history, particular rituals are followed and formal dress is worn, but it's also relaxed and friendly. Hurley also stressed the nature of the honour system as one in which the public make nominations, rather than an elite anointing those considered worthy. During the investiture itself, the names and citations of recipients are read, and each person enters the room, receives the insignia of their award, exchanges a few words with the Governor-General, and is photographed with him. At the end of the ceremony, the Governor-General spoke briefly once more. In this case, he noted the gender imbalance in the honours list overall and exhorted the audience to nominate worthy individuals, as well as praising the recipients. And after this, the audience stands as the Governor-General and his wife leave. Ceremony, ritual and symbolism, as I've said, have been key parts of the honours system, both in Britain and in its relatively new Australian form, and they form part of the weight and significance of awards. One of the reasons for scepticism expressed when the Order of Australia was created in 1975 related to its very newness. Some commentators mocked it for a supposed lack of dignity, partly a result of its brand new nature and partly because of its Australianness. This mockery tapped into the broader feeling of scepticism about the creation of new national symbols, identified by James Curran and Stuart Ward in their book, The Unknown Nation. In the irreverent 1970s, Such symbols of nationalism as anthems and awards seem to belong to an older era of jingoistic nationalism that was now perceived as humorous, if not dangerous. And it appeared difficult, if not impossible, to establish new symbols that carried appropriate meaning and dignity. There were snide references to Goth's gongs and the Order of the Wombat. But such responses to new local honours were not unique to Australia. Similar humour has been expressed about the idea of New Zealand honours, as when Sir Douglas Graham, a New Zealand cabinet minister, expressed support for the continued use of titles in the New Zealand Order being created in 1996 on the basis that, and I quote, "Despite the rather quaint, even obsolete terminology, the fact is it is a form of tradition in a young country rather light on tradition. And I doubt whether the Order of the Kakapo has the same impact as Knight Commander of the most distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George." So to some, there has seemed something inherently funny about new nations creating honours in an era in which there has existed a degree of suspicion about nationalism and patriotic ritual. This feeling of a need to create a sense of weight and tradition for new honours is not unique to former colonies, though, and it reveals the extent to which honours systems include what Eric Hobsbawm has described as invented tradition. The Order of the Bath was instituted in 1725 as part of an 18th century revival of certain chivalric rituals, Knights of the Bath being traceable to the 14th century, and a tradition of new knights having to bathe before they were dubbed to symbolically cleanse themselves of impurity to the 12th century. So this ritual was included in the statutes for the new Order of the Bath, which was to provide for the imperial state's need to reward political and state service, as its founders intended it to have an aura of ancient chivalric tradition, but it was never actually performed. So age and a sense of tradition are a part of what is seen to give honours their weight and value, and a part of that sense of tradition comes from the ceremony in the system. As Tobias Harper has said of the British system of honours in the 1980s and 1990s, quote, "Many found that their encounters with the royal traditional institution re-enchanted the honour, distancing it from the bureaucratic political realities of the system." More broadly, Harper has emphasised, "In a world where nearly every nation state has an honours system, the British one had and has greater depth and reach than most, because a large, although not unanimous, part of the public in Britain were willing and even eager to participate in the theatrical, ceremonial aspects of the system. The script and the set changed somewhat, but the palace-centred theatre of the system did not, giving it a continuity of ceremony and meaning." End of quote. So, to offer some reflections as I conclude, we cannot say quite the same of the Australian system, but it does have something of this continuity of ceremony and meaning through its British roots and recognisable ceremony of investiture. At the same time, the current Australian federal investiture stresses difference from those British roots through the Governor-General's emphasis in his remarks on the Australian system's difference from the former imperial one, in that it is a bottom-up system based on public nomination rather than a top-down one based on elite decisions. Yet this is to simplify the comparison somewhat, since it overlooks the extent to which in both countries, elites are more likely to be familiar with the system and more skilled in navigating the nomination process, as well as the role in awards decisions of the Council of the Order of Australia and the ways in which the British system itself has changed, including by giving a greater emphasis to public nominations. Honours investitures also, I think, seek to express the nation in the way that honours are described, and the way in which certain attributes of recipients may be depicted as particularly Australian. For example, in his speech at one 2019 investiture, the Queensland Governor stated that being recognised with an Australian honour reflects not only an exceptional personal achievement, but demonstrates the value Australians place on community outreach and on the importance of engaging with others and advocating for those qualities which sustain and bind us. This egalitarian awards system, he said, consolidates what it means to be an outstanding Australian, compassionate, curious, hardworking, generous with both time and talent. End of quote. Yet we might ask whether these attributes do indeed express something particularly Australian, or could be used of honours recipients, the world over. Finally, we might note the role of individuals in shaping these ceremonies. To some extent, an investiture may be shaped by the particular interests and opinions of a governor or governor-general. One notable feature of one April 2019 investiture conducted by David Hurley's predecessor as Governor-General, Peter Cosgrove, was that Cosgrove confined his remarks at the end of the ceremony more to the recipients themselves, emphasising the impressive nature of their achievements and service, and he didn't comment on the difference with the imperial system. Australia's federal system, in which there are both state and federal investitures, increases this trend. In watching just a handful of state ceremonies, I noted a few interesting points of difference within broadly similar ceremonies. For instance, a governor may place emphasis on the recipient's contributions to and location within the state as well as the nation, as did the New South Wales Governor Margaret Beazley in an investiture in November 2020. Or, to link to the themes of Heather's paper, and again it's interesting that it's Western Australia that's different. It was striking that a Western Australian investiture of August 2020 included a fulsome welcome to country, rather than a short acknowledgement of traditional owners, as had been the case in other ceremonies I'd watched. In this Western Australian investiture, the Governor, Kim Beazley, also invited guests to take a glass of something sparkling and lead a toast to the recipients before making his own remarks. Different states have also dealt differently with the need for COVID-safe protocols. In New South Wales in November 2020, recipients picked up their medals in a presentation box from a small table, while the Governor stood at the other side. While in a Victorian investiture this past March, close family members picked up the medals from a velvet cushion and pinned them on the recipients on the Governor's behalf. So to some extent, we might say that there is no one Australian investiture ceremony, but rather various ceremonies, each very similar, but potentially with differences of emphasis in how they express the nation, dependent on the individual who is Governor-General or Governor at the time. I will leave it there, and I would like to hand over now to Anne Duff.
Thank you, Karen. Well, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. My presentation will now focus on our third kind of national ceremony, the Australian Citizenship Ceremony. Attending a citizenship ceremony is the last step that candidates for citizenship by conferral take before they legally acquire citizenship status. I'll start my paper by briefly exploring the history of this Australian citizenship ceremony, its purpose and its contemporary features, before turning then to examine how citizenship is performed at those ceremonies and by whom, and what narratives about Australian national identity are being privileged through that performance. Prior to 1949, there was no citizenship ceremony, or indeed citizenship as a status in Australia. Those who sought to become naturalised as British subjects in Australia were required to satisfy a range of legislative criteria and then, importantly for this paper, make an oath of allegiance to the King or Queen of England before a judge. Notification of membership was then communicated to the successful candidate by a letter in the post. Following the introduction of Australian citizenship as a legal status in 1949, candidates were required to make that oath during a formal public ceremony. The first citizenship ceremony was held here in Canberra, and this is a still from a promotional video of that very first event. In explaining the purpose behind introducing a citizenship ceremony, Minister Arthur Calwell explained that it would signal the importance of Australian citizenship and would distinguish the process from what one might have gone through to acquire a dog or a motor car licence. Now, nearly 75 years later, the official purpose of this citizenship ceremony remains the same. It's still a public and formal ceremony designed to impress upon candidates the importance of citizenship and to recognise its privileges and responsibilities. The formality and dignity of the citizenship ceremony is communicated through the explicit use of ritual and the display of state and Commonwealth symbols. A typical citizenship ceremony runs as follows. Candidates enter and are seated before a stage or podium. The person conducting the ceremony, the presiding officer, speaks from the stage. On the stage, the official portrait of the Queen, the national coat of arms, and the Australian national and state flags are displayed. The presiding officer is usually a government official, either local, state, territory, or Commonwealth, and ministers, including the Prime Minister, conduct such ceremonies from time to time. After welcoming everyone, if the Minister for Home Affairs is not conducting the ceremony, then the presiding officer starts by reading aloud that minister's pre-prepared written statement, which you can find on the Department of Home Affairs website. The presiding officer and dignitaries might then give a few short speeches. Invited guests might include Indigenous elders who may conduct a welcome to country, and although encouraged, the welcome is not required. The main focus of the ceremony is on the pledge. The presiding officer starts by reading the preamble to the Citizenship Act, which largely mirrors the pledge. The presiding officer then asks the candidates to stand and reads the pledge out loud, one line at a time. And as a group, the candidates repeat back each line. After both forms of the pledge have been made, either under God or not, an affirmation ceremony might also be included. If an affirmation ceremony is included, the pledge will be recited a fourth time. The affirmation ceremony is an opportunity for all attendees, the new citizens and all invited guests to recite the pledge together. The certificates of citizenship are often subsequently distributed by the presiding officer. Individuals and family groups are often asked to walk onto the stage to receive their certificates, shaking hands with the presiding officer and dignitaries, and sometimes photos are taken to mark the event. At the end of the ceremony, the national anthem is sung, refreshments often follow, and sometimes a gift is given to new citizens. The citizenship ceremony, as I've just described, has features that appear in many other formal public ceremonies, features which serve to signal that a particular achievement is to be recognised and given social value. From school assemblies to graduations to awards nights, the pattern of entering, being seated, listening, receiving a document, shaking hands, celebrating with applause, mingling afterwards, is a well-known social ritual. The achievement that the citizenship ceremony values is membership in the Australian national community. Indeed, many speeches note that after a ceremony, the new citizens can, and I quote, now truly call themselves Australian. That concludes my brief outline of the history and purpose of the citizenship ceremony and the contemporary rituals and its symbols. I now would like to turn to talk about a shift in how Australian citizenship ceremonies are conducted. And I want to draw your attention to how tightly regulated the citizenship ceremony now is, and then reflect on what that might mean. Apart from ensuring that the oath was administered, local councils initially in the 1950s and onwards had quite wide discretion to hold ceremonies however they liked. Today, by contrast, the Commonwealth Government issues local councils and any other organisation wishing to hold a citizenship ceremony with a 46-page, very detailed document, which is called the Australian Citizenship Ceremonies Code. There are a few legal requirements set out in the code. However, the majority of the document consists of guidelines and recommendations, not strictly enforceable in law. There are, however, a number of measures that the government can use to ensure that the guidelines are followed. Specifically, the Commonwealth Government can refuse local councils or other organisations authorisation to hold citizenship ceremonies if either they have not previously followed the code or they have indicated that they will not follow the code. This extensive and prescriptive control ensures consistency. For a ceremony which is held frequently all over Australia by many different public officials, the code ensures that the content and the style of the ceremony remains remarkably similar all over the nation. The extensive yet indirect degree of official prescription about the performance of the citizenship ceremony is illustrated, I think, by the newly introduced dress code. Since 2009, the Citizenship Ceremonies Code now states that individuals ought to wear attire that, and I quote, reflects the significance of the occasion, and that local councils are permitted to elaborate on the detail in the form of a dress code. Our Prime Minister has communicated his view that iconic items of Australian beachwear, such as thongs and board shorts, are never appropriate at such a ceremony. Some local councils have agreed, others have gone further. For example, the Maribyrnong City Council has not only banned thongs and board shorts, but they've also banned a long list of items, including slippers, singlets, nightwear, sports apparel, offensive motifs, and overly torn clothing. While this might seem a small matter, and certainly what one wears on a particular day does not permanently constrain what kind of citizen one might be in the future, it nonetheless well illustrates the government's extensive control over the citizenship ceremony and how citizenship at that ceremony ought to be performed. However, local variation is possible. For instance, the Mayor of the City of Greater Geraldton, Mr. Shane Van Stein, has declared that overly prescriptive dress code is not fair dinkum, and he is on the record for stating that thongs and board shorts are appropriate for citizenship ceremony in his local council. However, this mayor runs the risk that he will be refused authorisation to hold citizenship ceremonies at all. This is indeed what the federal government has done in relation to a handful of local councils who have refused to follow another part of the code, specifically by refusing to hold citizenship ceremonies on Australia Day out of respect for our Indigenous Australians. There are other aspects of the code that are just as detailed and prescriptive and communicate rich official narratives about Australian citizenship. Sadly, I don't have time here to explore them further, but of course happy to discuss later if there's interest. The official description of the nature of the citizenship ceremony is that it is a welcome. However, I would argue that the tight control over the ceremonial context outlined suggests that the ceremony serves another purpose. The ceremony is a vehicle through which the Commonwealth Government conveys an official narrative about what citizenship means and allows it to monitor its consistent performance. It's now important to turn to articulate precisely whose expression of citizenship is being controlled at these ceremonies. As only those acquiring citizenship by naturalisation, now called conferral in Australia, are required to attend ceremonies at all, this means that it is only migrants' expressions of citizenship that are being so regulated. Only migrants are required to perform the Pledge of Commitment at a citizenship ceremony before they can call themselves Australian. Other kinds of citizens, citizens by birth or descent, for example, just declare that they are Australian, and this is accepted. Requiring migrants to submit to a different process marks out and distinguishes this category of individuals as something different. And the difference is not a neutral one. It indicates that this particular group needs additional checks. An application for Australian citizenship, including satisfying all the legislative criteria, including good character and English language tests, is just not enough. Performing the pledge in a public and official ceremonial context is a necessary additional step before their stated wish to become members of the Australian community is lawfully granted. To be sure, membership is acquired in a celebratory context, but also, I argue, under a cloud of suspicion. Moreover, the suspicion can linger and can affect the future lives of migrant citizens their attachment to Australia and their sense of belonging. The promise made at a ceremony operates to make migrants feel accountable for their future actions. The pledge, in a way, becomes a promise against which their future behaviour as citizens can be evaluated. Former Member of Parliament, Alan Cadman, articulates how the oath, as he because it's a pledge, promises the future of good behaviour that is enforceable by the weight of authority and the law. And he says, I think the only way in which we can influence those who want to subvert or change Australia to their own form of dictatorship or dominance is to have them understand that most Australians really do know what this country stands for. The only way in which that can be achieved is through the Citizenship Act, and by having the Citizenship Act as the basis of understanding. If somebody who has taken the oath seeks to corrupt or ignore it, they become answerable to the processes of the law. Candidates who make the pledge therefore make a public promise which renders their legal membership conditional on ongoing adequate performance of that citizenship. This creates, I would argue, different degrees of security and permanency associated with citizenship status, with migrants potentially experiencing the most precarious form of membership because it's the most conditional. This might come as a surprise, given the Australian government's explicit commitment to anti-racism, as well as allowing dual citizenship since 2002. I argue that this increased recent and contemporary concern over the proper performance of Australian citizenship at ceremonies has served to reanimate suspicions about migrants and the diversity that they bring into the Australian national community. Their difference then has, I argue, become a source of fear and something that the government can now use to justify preemptive measures in order to protect the Australian nation. I'd like to conclude my presentation by making three final, wider reflections about citizenship ceremonies and what they tell us about the ceremonial life of the nation, in particular by drawing on discussions of the ceremonies already covered by my co-panelists, Heather and Karen, and using that by way of comparison and contrast. So first, citizenship ceremonies are held more frequently than either investiture or swearing-in ceremonies. The more people that are involved, the more often the ceremony is held, and the wider the geographic distribution of the ceremonies, the more likely it is that the citizenship that it's performed and the way it's valued will be expressed in divergent ways. This unique feature of citizenship ceremonies might explain the significant investment in its official regulation and in its detailed prescriptions in the code. The degree of oversight today is not only much more extensive than it was when ceremonies were introduced 75 years ago, it's also much more extensive than in the other two kinds of national ceremonies we've looked at so far. This suggests that how national narratives are officially crafted and secured happens differently in different contexts. Whereas in investiture and swearing-in ceremonies, those conducting citizenship ceremonies may not have been as similarly vetted. As a consequence, more control perhaps is needed to ensure that the voice of a national authority is appropriately and consistently performed. Second, as with the investiture and swearing-in ceremonies, Australian citizenship ceremonies are public and formal occasions. But in the case of citizenship ceremonies, the celebration obfuscates a more controlling dimension. Not only is there a strict regulation of the performance of citizenship, but there is a strict surveillance of that performance. If the presiding officer does not verify that each candidate has made the pledge, they will not be granted citizenship status. The citizenship ceremony and making the pledge therefore has very high stakes for the candidates. This surveillance is not necessarily operational in either investiture or swearing-in ceremonies. Third and finally, the citizenship ceremony, while incorporating many distinct and modern Australian symbols, also uses, as Karen described, invented tradition to imbue a relatively new status of membership with importance and weight. The symbols and rituals of a British colonial past are used to achieve a gravitas. The Australian, for instance, the presence of the Queen is still announced even if only through her portrait. The Australian flag is prominently displayed, which still includes the Union Jack. And the local mayors often don their traditional garments for the occasion. In doing so, the Australian citizenship ceremony is limited in how much it can convey the narrative that the modern Australian nation is a culturally inclusive one. Attention, therefore, is created in seeking to convey importance and weight through the use of British ritual and symbols, which is apparent not only in citizenship ceremonies, but in investiture and swearing-in ceremonies. So thank you. That concludes my presentation, and thank you for your attention. I'd now like to pass the floor in a webinar back to Professor Martin Thomas, who will steer us into the next part of the webinar. But before I do, on behalf of the speakers here tonight, Heather, Karen, and myself, I'd like to briefly thank the individuals who've worked so hard behind the scenes to help put this webinar together. We are especially grateful to Professor Martin Thomas and Dr. Beatrice Bijon for facilitating the collaboration with the Menzies Australia Institute at King's College London. And to Darren Boyd, who you can't see, but I can, who has provided IT and technical assistance this evening. I'd also like to thank Frank in advance. We haven't heard what he has to say yet, but thank you very much for coming here tonight and for responding to our papers. So thank you, and Martin, back over to you.
Well, look, thank you very much. And one element of tradition that we tend to lose in these Zoom webinars is the applause. And so it's going to be a virtual applause coming through to you in Canberra, but really three really fascinating presentations. I'd like now to just hand straight over to Frank Bongiorno for his reflections. Thank you, Frank.
Great. Thanks so much, Martin, and thanks to all three speakers. White Australians have an image of themselves as casual and informal, perhaps, but alongside that, there's been a hunger for dignified ceremony. Each of the papers that we've heard tonight explores efforts to create and perform dignified ceremony in relation to the courts, to honours, and to citizenship. They're all post-imperial in the sense that they belong to a period after the British Empire and after Australians had ceased to regard themselves as British. Yet they also remind us that the rupture with Australia's British past, its imperial past in the 1960s and 1970s, was only ever a partial one. The novelist David Malouf has pointed to the continuation of subtle connections of a shared language, English, as well as, and I quote, a particular habit of mind and all that goes with it. And while, as Malouf points out, this is no longer a feast where Britain sits at the head of the table, the networks remain, as do many of the cultural and psychological legacies. We might add that Australian ceremony in the early decades of the 21st century is also that of a settler colonial nation, remaining embedded in its legacies and logics, even as Indigenous experiences and perspectives gain greater recognition. Now, Heather's paper perhaps grapples most directly with the settler colonial theme. The judges in the ceremonies that she discusses are white, and the ceremonies that she describes seek to articulate and place on the record the judge's understanding of the history, character, and purposes of the legal system in its Australian context. The first of her examples, from Chief Justice Martin in 2006 in Western Australia, recognises Aboriginal people's distinctive and often negative experience of the law, and he looked to the possibility of collaboration with Aboriginal people in improving this situation. His approach is liberal and programmatic in its basic thrust, and yet radical in recognising the way that a historical legacy of oppression, which he compares to South Africa's, and which in his view met the definition of genocide, has influenced the legal system's dealings with Indigenous people. Heather's second example, which includes an Indigenous welcome to country, reminds us of both what has changed and what remains constrained by the key or core assumptions of a white legal system, and one obviously rooted in the British legal system. There is recognition of the reality of Indigenous law having preceded British law chronologically and having survived the imposition of British law through the refusal to cede sovereignty. And yet the transcript of the ceremony, the document that will make its way into the archive that Heather discusses, does not record or translate the Aboriginal words that were spoken. Here, we're reminded, as we have been reminded in the research of our colleague here in the School of History, Laura Rademacher, of the way the hegemony of the English language and the marginalisation or suppression of Indigenous languages have been part of the colonising process, of the establishment of settler colonialism. The preservation and practice of such languages has often been part of an effort to resist assimilation and elimination and to assert Aboriginal self-determination and sovereignty. Karen Fox's account of honours ceremonies, I think, is especially vivid in revealing the ways in which the British heritage, identified by Malouf, has become embedded in contemporary Australian ritual and ceremony. The Order of Australia emerged as part of the new nationalism and of the Whitlam government's effort to rid the nation of what Whitlam called colonial relics. It was explicitly a modernising reform, something that Karen has shown in her detailed work on the honours system. And yet that system itself has also preserved many of the features of the more inclusive and democratic British honours system that emerged out of the First World War. That is, more democratic and inclusive than what the British honours system had been previously. So I'm thinking here, as Karen has discussed tonight, the continuing use of divisions, the recognition of hierarchies, all of this remains in the Australian system, alongside the effort to acknowledge ordinary people and not only the upper class or aristocrats, and women and not only men. Knighthoods and damehoods continued to stalk the system for years afterwards, as we've heard, being introduced back into the system by the Fraser government in the mid-1970s, and then being reintroduced by Tony Abbott for a brief time just a few years ago. The inequalities remain too. Women are still much less likely to be honoured than men and still remain poorly represented in the upper divisions of the Order of Australia. Yet the ceremony, Karen shows us, has sought to gesture towards the supposed informality and egalitarianism of Australian society, even while remaining formal and hierarchical in key respects. But it is, as she says, a classic case of an invented tradition, and one that seems still quite fluid, as if no one is quite sure what its essential features really are. As Karen shows, in the British imperial system, as it was reconstructed in the 19th century, there was a strain of medievalism that bordered on kitsch. This was never likely to be of much assistance in designing Australian honours and ceremonies, which were never going to be able to take on chivalric overtones. In this dry country, one might perhaps have the order of the shower rather than the order of the bath. The Australian honours system seems to recognise a need for dignified national ceremony without necessarily quite finding the words and gestures needed to make it happen, or at least to make it happen in a relatively settled way. We are left with a perfectly pleasant celebration, but not a highly structured ritual seen to be doing serious national work. The award of the honours perhaps are, but perhaps not the ceremony itself in quite the same way. Finally, Anne takes us to the citizenship ceremony. It's no ancient tradition either, although a little older than the honours ceremonies, or at least the Order of Australia honours ceremonies, since it came with the Citizenship Act in the late 1940s. I've not attended one of these, really for the kinds of reasons that Anne explains. It's migrants that are seen to need the ceremony to make this public expression of their adherence to the nation's values, not those of us whose citizenship came with our birth. Anne sees a strain of suspicion running through the ceremonies of the migrants themselves, who need to be held to certain obligations to conform to the norms of the community that they're joining, but also of those conducting the ceremonies. There's suspicion of them too. that the central authority basically believes they need to be told how to do it and what not to do. The pledge adopted by Australia in the mid-1990s reflected the republicanism of that era, removing any swearing or any direct swearing of allegiance to the monarch. Yet it's startling, and this is something that I wasn't aware of, so thank you very much, Anne. It's startling to learn that ceremonies have to display a picture of the Queen, something that on the face of it, given the nature of the pledge that now is used, it seems rather absurd in the 21st century. And I say that as someone who can see some value in constitutional monarchy. Of the three ceremonies here, it's this one, the citizenship ceremony, that's become most entangled in the culture and history wars, with the federal government threatening to take away from local councils the right to conduct ceremonies if they do not toe the line. Most significantly, in agreeing to run ceremonies on Australia Day, the 26th of January. This seems to me an illustration of a basic lack of respect for local democracy among national politicians who struggle to run a quarantine system or a vaccination program, but have an insatiable appetite for muscular demonstrations of jingoism, especially each January and April. It's apparently beyond the ken to understand that celebrating Australia Day in this particular way via a citizenship ceremony, as well as in other ways, is not going to be for everyone, and that it's reasonable for local councils to make decisions of this kind, not to have a ceremony that day, in response to the attitudes of their residents. We are left, it seems, with a ceremony that I think is the most ambitious of the three considered here in the national work that it's seeking to perform. Yet it's only able to do that work through efforts at central control and even on occasion coercion of a kind that demonstrate and perhaps perpetuate ideologically entrenched differences about national history, national identity, and national futures. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and another virtual applause to Frank there. Well, we've got some intriguing questions, and we'd welcome some more questions just while you're taking all this in. But let's start at the top. Grace Lee, who's a university student at the ANU, posed a question for Heather. She asks, particularly in recent years, as evinced by the Uluru Statement from the Heart, there has been discussions about entrenching a First Nations voice to Parliament and ensuring there is adequate Indigenous representation in our government. Do you believe that such discussions should be extended to the courts, those sitting on the bench in some way? Will that assist in reconciling our past and ensuring greater recognition of Indigenous law, LORE, as opposed to Anglo-Australian law, LAW?
Well, thank you for that question. Thank you, Martin, for relaying it, and thank you to Grace for, as ever, posing a very insightful question. I think it's inevitable that the Uluru Statement from the Heart will indeed influence all aspects of the exercise of political power in Australia. In my particular context, of course, I'm really interested in how members of the judiciary are grappling with concepts of identity in the ceremonies, and I have not yet seen enough after the Uluru Statement from the Heart to be sure of where that's going to lead, except I would note that Barry Mcguire gave his welcome to country in Western Australia shortly after the Uluru Statement. And I think that does reinforce, in particular for Western Australia, its willingness as a state to really grapple with and reflect upon how Indigenous Australians are going to be able to demonstrate, work within, and have relationships with those currently in power in the British colonial system. More generally, as I noted in my paper, we still have yet in the state Supreme Court level Indigenous Australians who can speak for themselves in a judicial swearing-in speech and give us their perspectives. Whether or not the Uluru Statement influences appointments to the judiciary is a very important question, one that we need to have another panel on, because obviously it influences and is controlled by a large number of political factors. My examples tonight were taken only from Western Australia. There are going to be some very interesting things in the ACT with a new Chief Justice coming, just announced today, sometime in March. But there will be important changes at the federal and individual state levels that we will all be able to watch with interest in this space. So thank you for such a fascinating question, Grace.
Yeah, thank you. And any comments from the other speakers or from the panel?
I think just to really explore, add on to what Heather just mentioned, I think the Uluru Statement of the Heart will and should have a much wider influence in all forms of ceremony, political and social life, in terms of acknowledging the Indigenous perspectives and on our lives. And there is a great place, I think, for it to be, for that conversation to happen about if we were to have more inclusive and diverse citizenship ceremonies, what it might be, what look like if we were to engage with the Uluru Statement of the Heart.
Well, thank you, Grace, for your excellent question. We're going to move along now. We've got a question from David White, and this question is especially for you, Karen. David writes, appointments to orders of chivalry have historically played an important part in diplomacy. One of the reasons for instituting the 5-tier Order of the British Empire was to allow awards to be made to members of the Allied forces as a response to awards made by those allies to British personnel. Karen, can you comment on the use that has been made by the Australian government of the Order of Australia in diplomacy? Is it constrained by not having comparable ranks to the orders of many nations?
Thank you, David. That's a really interesting question. Perhaps the first thing to say is that the Order of Australia is, I think, able to be used in that way. In a link to Anne's paper, you do have to be a citizen to be appointed to the Order of Australia as a normal member, but you can receive an honorary award. And I think that's where that diplomatic role comes in. There are a number of honorary appointments to the Order of Australia that have been made. In terms of the levels, it's interesting perhaps to note that that has been one of the arguments for including titles, and that's the case in New Zealand as well, that you know, being able to give that title of Sir carries more weight in a diplomatic setting. I don't personally think that that negates the role of the Order of Australia in the diplomatic setting to not have those titles. But I will note that that has been a criticism that's been made. I hope that answers your question to some degree.
I'm going to throw to you a question from Matthew Barton, who's in Canberra, and he comments that tonight's speakers have demonstrated how certain national narratives are woven throughout different ceremonies. What does the panel think about recent efforts from the Prime Minister to acknowledge veterans when giving the acknowledgement of country?
Frank, would you like to start with that?
Well, it seems very American, doesn't it? I mean, I think some of Scott Morrison's public performances seem very influenced by aspects of American civic culture, and I think that's one of them. And you know, I think it is also based on a kind of misunderstanding or misrecognition of what is happening in an acknowledgement of country. It's not a kind of a straightforward thank you. it's something much more profound than that. It's a symbolic recognition that all that we do, all that everyone does on Australian territory is being done on land taken from Indigenous people and on land in which a British sovereignty was imposed on Aboriginal law and Aboriginal sovereignty, and that Indigenous people, many Indigenous people, don't recognise that that sovereignty was somehow surrendered or ceded. And you know, the ceremonies have, I think, evolved, both welcome to country and acknowledgement of country seem to me to have evolved around recognition of those, you know, essentially, I suppose you'd call them post-Mabo historical insights. You know, I think the thanking of those who perform service for the country in a military context is it's a kind of category area in a way. It's really a different kind of debt of gratitude, I think, from what is going on in an acknowledgement of country statement, if you like, at the beginning of a public ceremony.
Just following on from this, we have a question. Oh, sorry. No, go on.
No, please,
Oh,
Martin.
I could probably, I think I may be ready to add. I think that's a really interesting question. And I agree with everything that Frank has already said. It causes me to think about the content of the current speech, the minister's pre-prepared speech that is read out by the presiding officer at the start of a ceremony if the minister, him or herself, is not there to conduct the ceremony. And as part of that, there's a current emphasis on the rights and responsibilities of Australian citizens to, I think the wording is defend and protect. So this is not really echoed anywhere else, and this is a fairly new introduction and wording and language used to describe the duties of Australian citizenship. So perhaps in some ways there's a heightening or a privileging of this particular kind of action by Australians to acknowledge its service. But I agree with what Frank has already said in the sense that it seems incongruous to the other kinds of recognitions that so far, at least up to this point, has the ways we've described what those rights and responsibilities are. This is a new direction, I think. Yeah, so.
Well, look, following from that, we have a question from Beatrice Bijon here at the Menzies. And she says, interesting how citizenship ceremony does not seem to acknowledge the value of migrants. They are asked to take an oath. Do we hear an Australian voice welcoming migrants and what they're bringing to Australia? Maybe say the word welcome in the migrants' language. Languages Australian and I think Indigenous Australian especially and foreign are so much and unheard in Australia. Anyone care to tackle that?
Oh, well, what a fantastic observation. I think it's certainly in citizenship ceremonies, the only language that you will hear is English. Well, I might bracket that with the ongoing and increasing inclusion of welcomes to country. We may, in fact, and hopefully should see more Indigenous languages being expressed, but certainly the ones that I've seen don't have that component. And certainly the expression by migrants of their backgrounds is quite, well, because of the level of prescription over the ceremony, there's really very little other than what they might wear, which can express that diversity. They don't say anything that is their own individual contribution or reflect on their own meaning of Australian citizenship. So, and they are and have been able to wear traditional dress as an alternative to the casual neat attire that's currently expressed. And you do see that, I think, in the ceremonies that I have attended, but that's the extent to which the diversity from the participants' perspective is expressed. Beatrice, you've noticed something, and I guess in my paper, in making decisions and trying to keep to time, I might have talked a little more about how those, both the speeches by the presiding officer and the dignitaries are encouraged to recognise and to talk to the diversity of the people and the candidates who were present. So thank you for the opportunity to add that. That said, those speeches are fairly brief. They're certainly not done in any other language. And there has been a removal of the word multiculturalism. So they might talk about the diversity of the people gathered, but that's about as far as they will go. They might acknowledge the history of the Australian nation as a multicultural one, but in terms of acknowledging the ongoing richness that diversity brings, that has been played down quite a bit in recent years, I would say.
If I could pick up there in relation to judicial ceremonies, I was obviously focusing today on the narratives and weaving in retellings of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the nation. We've had a number of migrant judges appointed to the bench. We've had a number of former and retired soldiers appointed to the bench. So picking up on Beatrice's question and the previous question, you see moulded in the speeches when crafting the individual as against this ideal notion of what an Australian judge is, you see the speakers negotiating the ideas around the importance of migrants to the formation of Australian legal culture and Australian culture more generally, and also the importance of service. I'm thinking particularly around the judges who had served in World War II and then speaking and welcoming them to the bench about discussing their sacrifice. But again, we see, as Frank was discussing so eloquently before, the dominance of the English language. And so even when the speakers are welcoming particularly migrant judges, some of whom spoke 4 or 5 languages before they came to Australia and learnt law in English. Again, there's very much the mediation of the idea of the ideal judge around the dominance of English as a language. And so there's a lot more that can and should be done in recognising in the legal community the value of diversity, cultural and ethnic diversity in particular, and what that brings to the judiciary. And that also links back to Grace's question at the outset.
Because I think what you've all said so far, well, it's a reminder that the great ceremony makers and the creators of ceremony that actually responds to this country in its specificity are, of course, the Indigenous nations of Australia. And I think this does invite perhaps even a little bit of comparison between different settler nations. We see in New Zealand how the haka, for instance, has developed and has in fact entered, if you like, the national liturgy. And while we do have things like our welcomes to country in Australia, which are perhaps entered in a rather fugitive way, we can't think, it's very hard to think of examples in which, in fact, Indigenous ritual has been inaugurated into the statecraft of Australia, and this must say something.
Yeah, I suppose one exception, Martin, that does spring to mind, it's a small one, would certainly be the incorporation of some Indigenous music I've noticed in Anzac Day ceremonies. And I've noticed that in London, at the ceremony there, and I've noted that it occurs here, I think, at the National Dawn ceremony. So that, I mean, it's perhaps a minor example, but that's one that does spring to mind. I don't know, as an effort to provide a greater historical depth, a sense of deep country within those ceremonies. But yeah, it's hard to think of other instances. Yeah.
It's an interesting example, Frank, and I maybe could just add that in one of the New South Wales ceremonies that I watched, I was struck to hear a didgeridoo as part of the national anthem. So it is coming in perhaps, but you know, as individuals decide to incorporate those elements.
I think there may be some tension with that, as there is in the incorporation of British traditional symbols, though, particularly since the narrative of the state is still one that hasn't acknowledged that sovereignty hasn't been ceded. So in terms of incorporating a variety of Indigenous traditions, I guess there's the risk that that's appropriation, right, and could lack genuineness. Of course, that would depend on the context and the conversations that hopefully would occur before the incorporation of those ceremonies.
I'd also just pick up on Anne's last point there to emphasise how much in each of our ceremonies, and this was a point that Karen made also, depends very much on the individual. In Anne's case, that's precluded very much because of the code. But for Karen's and my ceremony, so much depends on who's appointed to the bench or who's Governor General, who's running the show, who has power to control the elements. And Anne noted the controversial point regarding sovereignty. Well, in the ACT, not yet in a swearing-in ceremony, but in all other court ceremonies for the last 18 months, the Chief Justice has begun the court ceremony by recognising that sovereignty has not been ceded. Now, to my knowledge, she's the only Chief Justice in Australia to have done so. And I'll have to wait until March next year to see whether that also carries through into a swearing-in ceremony. But we are dealing with many federal differences as well as individual differences as well as the cultural appropriation issues that I think are very significant in that space also.
I think the appropriation issues are incredibly important, of course, and always have to be considered. But it's interesting too that in the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which has been spoken about, it's actually the Makarrata. It's a tradition from the Yolngu culture of northeast Arnhem Land, which is a means of settling differences between people. And this is actually being offered as a ceremonial solution. So very significant in its own right, I think. I'm going to move to a question from Melanie Nolan. Thank you, Melanie. Melanie has written, Anne, would you abandon the citizenship ceremony? How would you reform it? My citizenship ceremony on 17th of September 2015, on Australian Day, Citizenship Day at Government House, was unusually different. Many people wore clothes from where they originated. Everyone was asked to write a paragraph about why they valued Australian citizenship, which was read out. There were about 3 themes: Australia's multiculturalism, democracy, and peace. And
gosh, 2015. So from memory, there was a version of the code in operation, but certainly not as prescriptive as it currently is. That is one of the, I agree, I've not heard of a citizenship ceremony of that sort before, either in terms of looking through the videos or the ones that I've attended in order to research them and better understand them. How would I abandon them? Possibly. I'll have to think about that one. I know that for people who, for the people I've spoken to, despite my critical approach to it, they are, and I guess that speaks to the success of the ceremony, that they are very meaningful occasions. And at times, people have expressed to me that surprised them, that they may have gone into the ceremony thinking, oh, well, you know, I've got to get back to work at 5 o'clock. Can we hurry up? But actually got swept away in the event and the moment. And that did create an affection, perhaps, for the nation state that they weren't expecting. So certainly, I wouldn't necessarily want to deprive people of that opportunity.
So that sort of perhaps expresses my prevarication on to answer that. But I certainly, I'm not a fan of the overly prescribed ceremonies the way they're currently conducted. And as Frank mentioned, I think it is a very negative step to be removing authorisations from local councils who have said that out of respect for our Indigenous elders, they won't be conferring citizenship and holding ceremonies on Australia Day. And I think that's in a democracy. I would like to see more discussions like that. So perhaps if the ceremonies were more diverse, there were opportunities for people to speak about what it means to them. Some of my critical fears or thoughts would be allayed somewhat, but I don't know, perhaps you might like to speak.
I keep thinking of parallel with the marriage ceremony, which is very interesting in Australia. I mean, I've got a PhD student, Deborah Nance, working on this, and you know, effectively clergy, and of course since the 1970s, civil celebrants operate effectively as on behalf of the state, and there are certain requirements of the marriage ceremony. But I wouldn't have thought most people who participate in it feel terribly constrained, because they're able to design it or to shape it in a way that satisfies them. Now, there have been controversies. The requirement, for instance, around marriage being defined as between a man and a woman, which I think had to be stated, which of course is gone now, happily. But generally speaking, it's never seemed extremely prescriptive in a way that people felt was a burden, perhaps until that very ideological thing that happened around the definition of marriage. And you know, it too is a ceremony. It's perhaps not a, is it a civic ceremony? Yes, I think it is in some ways, in the way it operates in Australia, at any rate, which is a very distinctive way.
I think, and just to then respond, perhaps the thing that we might want to keep, and this is a question to you all, would be the ceremonial part, I guess, or the sense of giving it importance and crafting it in whatever way that ends up helping to achieve that. That we could keep, maybe.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the investitures, and I'm struck by the very celebratory nature of an investiture, you know, that it is an occasion to come together and celebrate, and people do really enjoy it, I think. And I'm also thinking about the comments that the Victorian governor made in one of the investitures that I watched, where she explicitly said, you know, a lot of you might be very humble and you might deflect the praise and, you know, point to everyone else who helped you get here. But this is a day for you, just for, you know, a few minutes, to bask in the fact that we're saying thank you and we're celebrating what you've done for your country and your community. And I think that is, you know, quite precious in some ways. Yeah.
And certainly in relation to judicial swearing-in ceremonies, they tend to be noticed more when they don't occur. So in Queensland, with the so-called Carmody affair, there was no swearing-in publicly held for Chief Justice Carmody because of the controversy around his appointment. But also in Australia, with judges appointed with no transparency, a tap on the shoulder is how they get appointed. It's the only opportunity for the legal community to gather to explain and defend why a particular person should be appointed to judicial office, why they hold the characteristics that we consider essential to exercise judicial power. And so without that ceremony, the Australian community at large would be completely in the dark as to what qualifications a particular individual brought to the role. And as my work explores how we can see change in what we need. And for instance, most recently, the requirement of cultural competency seems to be emerging as an essential requirement for judges, a recognition of the multicultural nature of Australian society, and also a recognition and respect for the knowledge and traditions of First Nations peoples.
Now, I'm going to have to be brutally and unceremoniously, in fact, interrupt here, and we're going to have to cut the electricity because, gosh, we're over time already. It's been such a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure it will continue in other ways, both in person and in publication. I apologise to the questioners who we didn't get to present your questions. We've just had such good questions. They got everybody talking, which is what they're meant to do. I can't go without thanking Karen Fox, Anne McDuff and Heather Roberts for the terrific work that's gone into this. Thank you, Frank Bongiorno, for being an eloquent respondent as always. Thank you, Darren Boyd, for managing the technical end in Canberra. And thanks to the team at King's College, to co-director Beatrice Bijon, and to James Baggerley, Blair Clark and Ellie Bignall. So it is a ceremonious goodbye from the Menzies Australia Institute. Look at our website for podcasts and information on other interesting events. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.